I was alone for 15 years until I found love again. But on my wedding day, my entire family skipped my ceremony to go to my son-in-law's birthday party. Just before walking down the aisle, my daughter texted, "Don't get married. Get out of there. We need to talk urgently." Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. For 15 years my life was a quiet, orderly museum dedicated to a single perfect memory. The memory of my husband Richard. Every room in my house, every book on my shelves, every piece of music I played was a curated exhibit of the life we had built together. The perfect, joyful moment shattered just as quickly as it had formed. As Lena pulled back from our hug, her face still beaming, Jonathan cleared his throat. The sound was not a simple, reflexive action, it was a carefully calibrated interruption, a sharp, intrusive noise designed to reclaim control of the room. That's wonderful news, Vivian, he said, his voice a smooth, practiced performance of warmth that didn't quite mask the cold, hard edge beneath it. We are so happy for you. There's just one small thing. He paused, a look of theatrical concern clouding his handsome features. You mentioned a date. What was it again? October 12th, I said, my own smile beginning to feel a little tight, a little strained. Jonathan's face fell. He pulled out his phone, his brow furrowed as he tapped on the screen, a pantomime of dawning, tragic realization. He looked up, his expression a masterpiece of carefully orchestrated dismay. Oh, Vivian, no, he said, his voice a low, mournful sob. I can't believe the coincidence. That's my 40th birthday. The air in the room instantly changed. Lena's bright, happy expression collapsed into one of confusion and then almost immediately of stress. She looked from me to her husband, her mind already caught in the terrible, invisible gears of a trap she didn't even see. Your birthday? She said, her voice small. Oh, Jonathan, I completely forgot. Of course you did, honey, he said, his voice dripping with magnanimity. He reached out and took her hand, his touch a gesture of comfort that was also a clear physical act of claiming her allegiance. You were excited for your mom. That's completely understandable. He turned his gaze to me, his eyes full of a deep, sorrowful apology that I knew, with a sudden chilling certainty, was completely false. Vivian, I am so sorry. This is just a terrible, terrible coincidence. A once-in-a-lifetime milestone for me, and the happiest day of your new life. What are we going to do? He framed it not as his problem, but as our problem, a shared tragedy that had befallen the family. He was the victim of an unfortunate cosmic accident. I immediately tried to defuse the situation, to remove the impossible choice he had just placed on my daughter's shoulders. Oh goodness, don't you worry for a second, I said, forcing a light, airy laugh. We can change the date. It's no trouble at all. The venue has other openings, I'm sure. But Jonathan was already shaking his head, his expression one of noble sacrifice. No, Vivian, you can't do that, he said, his voice firm. This is your day. You've had your heart set on it. We wouldn't dream of asking you to change. We'll have to figure something out. He had expertly, cruelly checkmated me. By refusing my offer to change the date, he made himself look like the gracious, accommodating one, while simultaneously ensuring the conflict remained. He had created an intractable problem and then martyred himself upon it. The rest of the evening was a study in subtle manipulation. Jonathan spoke of his upcoming milestone birthday with a kind of regretful excitement, talking about the small get-together he and Lena had been planning. He made it clear, without ever saying it directly, that his 40th was an event of immense, non-negotiable importance. He had successfully reframed the entire situation. My wedding was no longer a joyful celebration for the whole family. It was now a scheduling conflict, an inconvenient event, that was competing directly with a more important pre-existing one. As they left that night, Lena gave me a strained, apologetic hug. The pure joy she had felt just an hour before was gone, replaced by the weary, anxious look of a woman torn between two loyalties. Jonathan, on the other hand, gave me a warm, reassuring smile. Don't you worry, Vivian, he said, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. We'll make it work. But I saw the look in his eyes, a flicker of cold, triumphant satisfaction. He had taken my happiest moment and turned it into a weapon against me, and I knew, with a terrible sinking feeling, that this was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, Jonathan's campaign against my happiness became a masterclass in psychological warfare, a slow, methodical poisoning of the family well. He never attacked me directly. His methods were far too sophisticated for that. Instead, he waged a war of attrition, using the memory of my late husband Richard, as his primary weapon. He became the self-appointed guardian of Richard's legacy, a legacy he seemed to believe my newfound happiness was desecrating. The attacks were small, subtle, and always delivered with a veneer of loving concern. He would call me out of the blue, his voice full of warmth. "Vivian, I was just looking at that old photo of you and Richard at Lena's graduation. You two were the perfect couple. A love like that, it's a once-in-a-lifetime thing, isn't it?" The implication was clear. My love for Richard was a finite resource, and my relationship with George was a cheap imitation. He was even more effective with Lena, preying on the deep, unresolved grief she still carried for her father. I would hear about his comments from my daughter, who would repeat them with a troubled, confused expression. "Jonathan was saying the other night how hard this must be for you, Mom," she told me over the phone one evening. "He said he just hopes this George fellow understands how much Dad meant to this family, how big his shoes are to fill." He was framing George not as a partner for me, but as a replacement for her father, a role no man could ever successfully fill. He was creating an impossible standard, ensuring that George would always fall short in my daughter's eyes. He was a master of the backhanded compliment, the concerned criticism. He would praise George for his kindness, then add, "It's wonderful how good he is to you, Vivian. A lonely woman at your age needs a companion." He made my desire for love sound like a pathetic geriatric neediness, not a joyful, life-affirming choice. His most insidious tactic was the way he began to speak of my home, the home I had shared with Richard, as a kind of sacred, untouchable museum. When I mentioned I was thinking of repainting the living room, a project George had offered to help with, Jonathan's reaction was one of quiet, theatrical horror. He conveyed it to Lena, who then conveyed it to me. "Jonathan thinks it might be a bit soon, Mom," she said, her voice hesitant. "He just feels like so much of Dad's presence is still in that room. He's worried that changing it will feel like you're erasing him." He was turning my own home into a prison of memory, a place where any change, any step toward a new future, was an act of desecration against the sainted husband and father. He was appointing himself the high priest of my grief, and he was using his position to isolate me, to make me feel guilty for the very happiness I had just rediscovered. The effect on the wider family was subtle but undeniable. I would hear it in the hesitant tone of my sister's voice when she asked about the wedding plans, in the way my cousins would steer the conversation back to the good old days with Richard whenever I mentioned George. Jonathan was conducting a whisper campaign, and it was working. He was successfully painting a picture of me as a slightly confused, grief-stricken widow who was rushing into a new relationship, a woman who needed to be protected from her own foolish, lonely heart. And he, of course, was the noble, concerned son-in-law, the man who was only trying to protect the memory of the great man who had come before him. The truth, the cold, hard, and ugly truth, was that he was not protecting Richard's memory. He was protecting what he saw as his and Lena's inheritance. The slow, insidious campaign of doubt was not enough for Jonathan. He needed a grand, decisive gesture, a public power play that would force the entire family to choose a side and demonstrate, in the most public way possible, where the true center of power in the Monroe-Pierce family now lay. He found his opportunity in his own 40th birthday party. The small get-together he had so mournfully described on the night of my engagement announcement began to undergo a stunning and rapid transformation. A week after our conversation, Lena called me, her voice a mixture of excitement and apology. "Mom, you're not going to believe this," she said. "Jonathan's partners at the firm found out it was his 40th and they've decided to throw him a surprise party. It's gotten completely out of his hands." I knew with every fiber of my being that Jonathan's hands were firmly on the wheel of this entire production. The surprise party quickly escalated from a simple dinner to an extravagant catered affair. The venue, I learned through the family grapevine, was no longer their house. It was to be held on a massive 3-tiered yacht, chartered for a sunset cruise around the harbor. The guest list grew exponentially. It was no longer just a few close friends, it was a who's who of the city's legal and business elite. And then the invitations arrived. They were not simple cards but thick engraved monstrosities, delivered in velvet-lined boxes. I received one, of course. It was a clear, calculated power move, an invitation to my own execution. It read, "You are cordially invited to celebrate the 40th birthday of Jonathan Pierce with a sunset champagne cruise." The date was printed in bold, elegant script, October 12th. My wedding. He sent these elaborate invitations to every single member of my extended family, my sisters, my brothers, my cousins, even my elderly aunts who rarely left their homes. He was creating an event so glamorous, so exclusive, so irresistibly ostentatious that it made my own modest wedding ceremony at the local botanical garden seem like a drab, insignificant affair. He was forcing everyone to make a very public choice. On one side was my quiet, second-chance wedding to a man they barely knew. On the other was a spectacular once-in-a-lifetime party for the powerful, successful man who was now the undisputed patriarch of the family. It was a battle I had no chance of winning. The phone calls began almost immediately. They were a symphony of flimsy apologetic excuses. My sister called, her voice dripping with false regret. "Vivian, I am so terribly sorry, but you know how much Jonathan has done for my son, getting him that internship. We simply have to make an appearance at his party. We'll come to the wedding for a few minutes, of course, but we can't miss the boat." My cousin called, his apology even less convincing. "Viv, it's a yacht. I've never been on a yacht. We'll be thinking of you though." One by one, my family, the people who were supposed to be my support system, the people who had stood by me through the darkest days of my grief, all chose the glittering hollow spectacle of Jonathan's party over the quiet, heartfelt sincerity of my wedding. They were choosing power over love, glamour over loyalty. Jonathan had not just scheduled a competing event, he had staged a coup, and he had won. I was to be a queen on my wedding day, but I would be reigning over an empty kingdom. To justify this grand, cruel act of social warfare, Jonathan needed to provide the family with a more compelling reason than a simple scheduling conflict. He needed to give them a moral justification for their abandonment, a way for them to feel not like they were betraying me but like they were protecting me. And so he escalated his campaign of doubt, turning his vague, insidious whispers about George into a full-blown investigation. He began planting seeds of active suspicion in Lena's mind, preying on her protective instincts and her deep-seated fear of seeing me hurt again. He knew that if he could convince Lena that George was a threat, the rest of the family would fall in line behind her. His methods were, as always, maddeningly subtle. He would wait for moments when Lena was stressed or tired, and then he would strike. "You know, honey," he said to her one evening, his tone one of loving, husbandly concern, "I was just thinking about George. It's strange, isn't it?" Lena's decision to run a background check on George was an act of desperation. A desperate attempt to silence the chorus of doubts her husband had so masterfully conducted in her mind. She told me later that her hand trembled as she typed George's name into the online portal of a discreet investigation service. She felt a profound sense of shame, a deep, sickening guilt at this profound invasion of privacy. But Jonathan's voice was in her ear, whispering of predators and hidden secrets, and her fear for my safety had finally outweighed her respect for my autonomy. She clicked the button, paid the fee, and then spent the next 48 hours in a state of agonizing suspense, half praying that the report would come back completely clean and half praying that it would contain some small damning detail that would justify her betrayal. The report arrived in her inbox on the afternoon of October 11th, the day before my wedding. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely open the encrypted file. The report was for the most part exactly what she had hoped for, and exactly what Jonathan had feared. It was a clean, unremarkable history. George Peterson was exactly who he said he was. He was a highly respected, award-winning architect. His career was impeccable, his finances were in order. His first wife had died of cancer, just as he had said. He was, by all accounts, a good, honest man. Lena felt a wave of profound, dizzying relief wash over her, a relief so intense it almost made her weep. But her relief was immediately followed by a fresh wave of shame. She had violated the trust of this good man, and for what? To appease the paranoid fantasies of her manipulative husband. She was about to close the file, to delete the report and try to forget this ugly episode ever happened, when her eyes caught a small, anomalous detail tucked away in a section on his early life. A footnote from a past he had never mentioned. The report detailed a business he had started in his 20s, long before he became a successful architect. It was a small construction company, a partnership with his brother, and in the fine print, there was a record of a bankruptcy, a business failure from over 40 years ago that had left him with a mountain of debt it had taken him years to repay. The report also listed a single, estranged child from his first marriage, a son he had not had contact with in over 30 years, a painful casualty of a difficult divorce. It was a secret, yes, a painful, deeply buried part of his past. But it was not a crime. It was a human story of failure, and of loss. Lena, in her heart, understood this. But she also knew that in the hands of her husband, this human story could be twisted into a weapon. That evening, just as the final preparations were being made for my wedding, Lena confronted Jonathan. She did not intend for it to be a confrontation. She intended it to be a confession, an apology for her own weakness. She showed him the report, intending to say, "Look, I was wrong. You were wrong. He's a good man. This is just a sad story from a long time ago." But Jonathan did not give her the chance. The moment he saw the words bankruptcy and estranged child, his eyes lit up with a look of vicious triumphant vindication. He did not see a human story. He saw ammunition. "I knew it," he exclaimed, his voice a low triumphant hiss. "I told you, Lena, the man is a liar, he's a fraud." "Jonathan, no," Lena pleaded, her voice desperate. "This was 40 years ago. He was just a kid. It has nothing to do with who he is now, and the son, it's just sad." But Jonathan was not interested in sadness, or in context. He had his proof. He snatched the phone from her hand, his expression one of righteous fury. "He has been lying to your mother this entire time," he declared, his voice rising. "He is hiding a failed business and a secret family. He is a con man, and he is after her money, just like I said. We have to protect her. The family needs to know." Before Lena could stop him, he began to make calls. He called my sister, he called my brother. He called my cousins. He spun a tale of a dangerous, secretive man who had wormed his way into my life. A man with a hidden past of financial failure and secret children. He twisted George's past shame into a present-day threat, his narrative a masterpiece of malicious exaggeration. He used Lena's reluctant, guilt-ridden confirmation as his ultimate weapon. "Lena is devastated," he would say into the phone, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "She discovered it all herself. She's so brave." He was not just exposing a secret, he was cementing the family's decision to abandon my wedding. He was giving them the moral high ground. They were no longer just choosing a better party, they were making a noble stand to protect their vulnerable, foolish matriarch from a dangerous predator. And as Lena stood there, watching her husband systematically destroy her mother's happiness, she finally began to understand the true nature of the man she had married. His concern was not for her mother, it was for himself, and his victory had just become absolute. The morning of October 12th dawned bright and clear, a perfect, brilliant autumn day. The kind of day a bride dreams of. I awoke in my own bed, a sense of serene, joyful calm settling over me. Today I was not a widow, I was not a museum curator, I was a woman on the verge of a new beginning. I spent the morning in a happy, quiet daze, sipping tea, talking on the phone with my closest friends who were flying in for the ceremony. I did not hear from my family. Not from my sister, not from my brother, not from Lena. I told myself they were busy, that they were getting ready for the two big events of the day. A small cold knot of dread had begun to form in my stomach, but I pushed it down, refusing to let it cloud the perfect blue sky of my happiness. I arrived at the Botanical Gardens Grand Conservatory, the venue for our wedding, a few hours before the ceremony. The place was a paradise of glass and green, filled with towering palm trees and the sweet, intoxicating scent of 1,000 blooming flowers. The small, elegant space we had chosen for the ceremony was set up with rows of white chairs, a floral archway dripping with orchids, and a string quartet softly rehearsing in the corner. It was everything I had dreamed of, but as the minutes ticked by, as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the beautiful empty chairs began to feel less like a promise and more like a judgment. My friends began to arrive. Their warm hugs and happy congratulations a stark contrast to the echoing silence from my own family. I retreated to the small bridal suite, a lovely sun-filled room overlooking the gardens, to get dressed. My hands were shaking slightly as I zipped up my dress, a simple, elegant gown of ivory lace. The knot of dread in my stomach was now a cold, heavy stone. And then the text messages began to arrive, a coordinated digital fusillade of betrayal. The first was from my sister. "Vivian, so sorry. Something has come up. Won't be able to make it to the ceremony, but will try to stop by the reception later. Have a wonderful day." The second was from my brother. 5 minutes later. "So sorry, Viv. Crisis at work. Thinking of you, will see you at Jay's party tonight." Then came the flood. One after another, my cousins, my aunts, my uncles, the people whose births, weddings and funerals I had attended without fail for my entire life, all sent their flimsy last-minute apologies. Their excuses were a transparent lie, a thin veil of politeness over a cold, hard act of abandonment. They had chosen the yacht. They had chosen Jonathan. The coordinated nature of the messages, the almost identical wording made it clear that this was not a series of individual decisions. This was a verdict. I had been judged by my own family, and I had been found wanting. I sat on the small velvet settee in the bridal suite, my beautiful dress feeling like a costume for a play that had just been cancelled. The heartbreak was a physical thing, a sharp, crushing weight on my chest. I had endured the long, lonely years after Richard's death with a quiet stoicism. I had never asked for their pity, never burdened them with my grief. This new love, this second chance with George was the first thing I had wanted for myself in 15 years. And they had, with a casual collective cruelty, decided I did not deserve it. I looked at my reflection in the ornate mirror. I saw a 62-year-old woman, a bride with no family, a queen with no court. But as I looked closer, I saw something else. Too, I saw the quiet, resilient strength that had carried me through the darkest days of my life. I had survived the death of my soulmate. I would survive this. I would not let them break me. I would walk down that aisle, my head held high, and I would marry the good man who was waiting for me. I stood up, took a deep, steadying breath, and prepared to walk out of that room and into my new life. And that's when my phone buzzed one last time. It was a text from a number I knew by heart, the one number whose silence all day had been the most painful of all. It was from my daughter, Lena. I opened it expecting another hollow apology, but the words on the screen were not an excuse. They were a terrifying, world-altering command. Don't get married, get out of there, we need to talk urgently. The words on my phone screen seemed to hover in the air, a stark black and white declaration of war against my own happiness. Don't get married, get out of there, we need to talk urgently. My mind, already reeling from the coordinated betrayal of my entire family, struggled to make sense of this new terrifying assault. The message was from Lena, my Lena. The daughter who had just moments ago been part of the conspiracy to abandon me, was now sending a frantic, desperate warning. The contradiction was so profound, so jarring that for a moment, I thought I must be hallucinating, that the grief and the shock had finally broken something inside my mind. I read the message again, and again. The words did not change. They were a siren, a scream in the digital silence. I stood frozen in the bridal suite, the gentle, hopeful melodies of the string quartet drifting in from the conservatory, a mocking soundtrack to the complete and utter implosion of my world. My first thought was that this was another one of Jonathan's games, a final, cruel twist of the knife designed to inflict the maximum possible pain. Had he coerced her into sending this? Was this his way of not just ruining my wedding day, but of destroying my faith in the one person left on this earth, whom I trusted completely? The thought was so ugly, so monstrous, that it almost took my breath away. But then I read the message again, and I saw the raw, unedited panic in the capitalized words, in the lack of punctuation. This wasn't the slick, calculated manipulation of Jonathan. This was the authentic, terrified voice of my daughter. Something was terribly wrong. I was faced with an impossible, soul-destroying choice. Down the hall, in a sun-drenched conservatory filled with flowers, a good, kind man was waiting for me. A man who had offered me a second chance at a life I thought was over. He was my future, my hope, my quiet, peaceful harbor after 15 years on a lonely sea. My entire family had already abandoned me in favor of my son-in-law's birthday party. They had made their choice, and in doing so they had pushed me toward George, solidifying my decision to leave them behind and embrace my new life. But now my own daughter, from the very heart of that betrayal, was screaming at me to run away from that harbor, to turn my back on that future. To trust her would be to trust the one person who had already broken my heart today. To ignore her would be to risk ignoring a danger so great that it had compelled her to betray her own husband's celebration. The wedding coordinator knocked softly on the door. "Mrs. Monroe? It's time. Your guests are seated." My guests. A small, loyal handful of my own friends. A sea of empty chairs where my family should have been. I looked at myself in the mirror one last time. I saw a bride on the verge of a nervous breakdown. My carefully constructed composure was cracking. The serene, resilient matriarch giving way to a frightened, heartbroken old woman. What was I to do? Walk down that aisle and marry George pretending I hadn't seen my daughter's desperate plea? Or obey her cryptic command, halt the ceremony, and humiliate the one good man who had stood by me, all on the word of a daughter who had chosen a yacht party over her own mother's wedding? My heart was being torn in two, but in the end there was only one choice I could make. The bond between a mother and a child, no matter how frayed, no matter how damaged, is a primal, powerful thing. I would not, walk down that aisle with her terrified words echoing in my mind. With a hand that trembled so badly I could barely control it, I picked up my phone and texted my best friend, who was waiting for me outside the door. "Tell them there's been an emergency. Tell George I am so sorry." Then I walked out a side door, into the fading afternoon light, and left my own wedding, a fugitive from a happiness that had been just moments before finally within my grasp. I met Lena at a quiet, anonymous hotel bar a few miles from the botanical garden. I had walked there, my beautiful ivory wedding dress feeling like a cruel joke, drawing stares from people on the street. I didn't care. I was in a state of shock, my mind a numb, buzzing void. I saw Lena sitting in a dark corner booth before she saw me. She looked terrible. Her glamorous party dress was rumpled. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying, and her face was a mask of guilt and frantic anxiety. She was a world away from the confident, happy woman I had raised. The moment she saw me, she burst into a fresh torrent of tears, a storm of ugly, broken sobs. "Mom?" she wept, her voice thick and ragged. "Oh, Mom, I am so sorry. I am so sorry for everything." I sat down opposite her, a strange, cold calm settling over me. I had already left my own wedding. The worst had already happened. Now, all that was left were the answers. "What is it, Lena?" I asked, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. "What was so urgent that you couldn't have told me this morning? What was so important that you had to destroy my wedding day to tell me?" Her tears subsided, replaced by a look of profound, gut-wrenching shame. "It's George," she whispered, her eyes refusing to meet mine. "Mom, he's not who you think he is. He's been lying to you." She then recounted the entire sordid story. She told me about Jonathan's campaign of whispers, about the seeds of doubt he had so expertly planted in her mind, and she confessed, her voice cracking with self-loathing, to running the background check. "I was so scared, Mom," she said, her voice pleading for understanding. "Jonathan had me so convinced that George was some kind of predator, that he was after your money. I was just so afraid of you getting hurt." She pulled out her phone and showed me the report. She showed me the hidden details of George's past, the bankruptcy of a business he had started in his 20s, the estranged son from a marriage that had ended over 3 decades ago. "He's a liar, Mom," she said, her voice gaining a note of her husband's righteous certainty. "He never told you about any of this. He has a secret family, a history of financial failure. Jonathan was right. The man is a fraud." I listened to her, and I looked at the report on her phone. And in that moment, in that dark, sterile hotel bar, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. But it was not the puzzle she thought she was solving. As I listened to my daughter parrot her husband's narrative, as I saw the genuine fear and conviction in her eyes, I realized the true nature of the con that had been perpetrated. The secret of George's past was not the real issue. It was a sad human story of failure and loss, a story from a lifetime ago. The real issue was the disproportionate, malicious and masterfully manipulative way that Jonathan had used that secret. I saw, with a terrible soul-crushing clarity, that Jonathan's concern was never, not for a single moment, about protecting me. It was, and always had been, about controlling me. He saw my marriage to George as a threat to his position as the patriarch of our family, a threat to his influence over my daughter, and most importantly a threat to the inheritance he felt he was owed. He had not been protecting me from a predator. He had been the predator all along, a wolf in the expensive clothing of a concerned son-in-law, and he had turned my own daughter into his unwilling accomplice. Lena, seeing the strange quiet calm on my face, trailed off. Her words faltered. She had expected me to be horrified, to be grateful for her intervention. She did not expect the profound, pitying sadness that she now saw in my eye. And as she looked at me, really looked at me, she finally for the first time began to understand how thoroughly and how cruelly she had been manipulated. The final, devastating domino fell not with a crash, but with a quiet, heartbreaking click. As Lena stared at my face, her own expression began to change from one of frantic righteousness to one of dawning, gut-wrenching horror. She was a brilliant woman, my daughter, and in the quiet, reflective space of my own calm, she was finally able to see the full, ugly tapestry of her husband's manipulation. She saw that the secret in the report was a flimsy pretext, a convenient excuse for a campaign of sabotage that had been in motion for months. She saw that Jonathan's triumphant "I knew it" was not the reaction of a concerned man, but the cry of a victorious conspirator. "He wanted this," she whispered, the realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow. "He wanted to ruin today. He wanted everyone to choose him." I simply nodded, my heart aching for the pain she was now feeling. "Yes, sweetheart," I said softly. "He did." Her composure finally broke completely. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with a new kind of sob, a sob, not of panic but of profound, soul-deep shame. The full weight of her own complicity, her own weakness, came crashing down on her. "What have I done?" she wept. "Oh Mom, what have I done?" I did not offer her empty comforts. I offered her the hard, clean truth. "You allowed yourself to be manipulated by a man who preys on your fears and your love for me," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "You made a mistake, Lena, a terrible, painful mistake. But it is not too late to fix it." I left her there in the hotel bar, a broken woman who was perhaps for the first time beginning to see her life clearly. I had my own mistake to fix. I took a taxi to George's house, my mind a whirlwind of fear and hope. What would I say? How could I possibly explain the beautiful tragic mess of my family? He opened the door, his face a mask of confusion and deep profound hurt. He was still in his tuxedo, but it was rumpled now, his tie loose. He looked like a man who had been waiting for a celebration that had turned into a wake. "Vivian," he said, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't quite decipher. "What happened? Are you all right?" And there on his doorstep in my ridiculous poignant wedding dress, I told him everything. I told him about Jonathan's campaign of cruelty, about the forced choice of the birthday party, about my family's betrayal. And then, with a deep breath, I told him about the background check, and about the secret she had found. As I spoke the words, bankruptcy and estranged son, I saw a look of deep profound shame cross his handsome features. He looked down at the ground, unable to meet my eye. He did not deny it. He did not try to lie. He simply nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "It's true," he whispered, his voice hoarse with a shame that was decades old. "All of it." He then told me his story. He told me of a foolish, ambitious young man who had made a series of terrible business decisions, a failure that had cost him everything and had taken him years to recover from. He told me of a bitter, painful divorce, and of a son who had chosen to side with his mother, a wound that had never truly healed. "I was going to tell you, Vivian," he said, his eyes finally meeting mine, and I saw that they were filled with tears. "I was so afraid. My life with you, it felt so perfect, so clean. I was ashamed of the messy, broken parts of my past. I was afraid that if you saw them you wouldn't want me." His confession, his vulnerability, his profound, deeply human fear, did not push me away. It pulled me closer than I had ever been. In that moment, I did not see a liar or a fraud. I saw a good man, a man I loved, who had been carrying a heavy burden of shame for a lifetime. I saw the man Jonathan had tried to destroy, and the man I now knew, with absolute certainty, I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. I reached out and took his hand. "George," I said, my own voice now thick with emotion, "there is nothing you could tell me that would ever make me leave." A week later, George and I were married. There was no grand conservatory, no string quartet, no sea of empty chairs. Our wedding took place in the backyard of my home, under the shade of the old oak tree where Richard and I had carved our initials so many years ago. It was a simple, heartfelt ceremony, attended by a small, loyal group of our dearest friends. Lena was there. She stood by my side as my maid of honor, her eyes clear and full of a quiet, fierce love. Her journey back from the brink had been a difficult one. She had returned to the yacht that day, and confronted her husband, not with tears or hysteria, but with a cold, quiet fury that he had never seen before. The battle for her soul, I knew, was far from over, but in that moment, she had chosen her mother. She had chosen the rest of my family was not there. They were casualties of a war they had not even understood. They were fighting. Perhaps one day those bridges could be rebuilt, perhaps not. But as I stood there, holding George's hand, the warm autumn sun on my face, I did not feel their absence as a loss. I felt it as a clarification. The quiet, orderly museum of my past was finally closed. I was no longer its curator. I was standing in the bright, messy, and beautiful reality of my future. And for the first time in 15 years I had never felt less alone. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.